John Lynch, Kyle Shanahan, both of them spoke to the media this week, and safe to say that there was a lot of talk behind the quarterback situation and more. Me and Akash, we're going to break it down right after this.
Let's go get him. Let's go get him today, man. Let's go. Hey, dominate on 3. 1, 2, 3. Dominate.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the show. And today we've got a special guest with me, a guy who hasn't been on the show, but someone who everyone knows in the 49ers community, Akash Anavarathan. How you doing, man?
I'm doing fantastic. Appreciate you for having me.
And appreciate you for coming on. Before we start, Akash recently worked at Niners Nation. I'm sure a lot of you guys have read a good amount of his work. Appreciate everything you've done there. But let's start. I mean, 49ers, it's never a dull moment when you cover the 49ers, when you're around this team. We went from the end of the season immediately to Brock Purdy's surgery, quarterback talk, all this different talk. Now we were kind of in the free agency draft stage, Javon Hargrave signing, all of that, Sam Darnold signing. And now at the annual owners meeting, we heard both John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan talk. Let's start with John Lynch. His press conference was yesterday. Shanahan spoke today. What was kind of the initial thoughts when you heard some of John Lynch's comments overall?
I think the first thing that immediately jumps out is the headline / comment that probably went viral yesterday, which is, Brock Purdy, when healthy, is the leader in the clubhouse or clubhouse leader to be starting quarterback. And I think a lot of us kind of expected that, right? It's been kind of trending that way. The players have been talking like that. Coaches, John Lynch, when they did their end of season presser, kind of hinted at it. The big J's, right? Albert Breers, the Peter Kings, they've been kind of hinting at it, but it was the first time that, someone with the 49ers actually said those words. And right. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaway I had.
I mean, I have to agree. I mean, when Lynch comes out and says it, we've heard John Lynch speak before. A lot of people have kind of dismissed his talk as PR talk and all that kind of stuff, just in a way, sidestepping what he said. But he flat out said it. He said Brock has earned the right with the way he's played. He's probably the leader in the clubhouse. I thought the second part of his comment was also interesting. He followed that up while saying, I'll let Kyle make those decisions, indicating really where the quarterback talk kind of goes. But it is interesting because we've heard players said it. I mean, Trey Lance himself said he acknowledged how well Brock Purdy played last year and really just wanted a chance for a competition. And I mean, you heard George Kittle say it. I think Nick Bosa has also said it. Overall, people were pretty excited with the way that Brock Purdy played last year. And I think that definitely has an impact on the locker room and clearly on the front office with John Lynch saying what he said. So definitely interesting. But we have to add on the caveat, which is we don't know when he's going to be there. Lynch came out yesterday. He said that it was around training camp that they hope for him to be back. Were you surprised that he said that at all?
No, because I think there's different angles to this. I think the one thing that was consistent between John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan is that at the 12-week mark is when they'll get an idea about Brock Purdy's recovery. And I think based off of his surgery date, that's June 2nd. So I think that's like right in the middle of OTAs. So at that point, they hope to have Brock Purdy starting to, throw and kind of get an idea of where his rehab's going. And I think training camp starts about a month after that. And so, all he said was he hopes to be ready by training camp. That I don't think that means he's going to be 100%. Doesn't mean he's going to be full go. I think, they're hoping he'll be participating in some capacity, whether that's throwing on a side field, doing some limited action, something similar to what Jimmy Garoppolo was doing last season as he was rehabbing an injury. So I think that's what he was getting at. I just think when you just hear the words ready by training camp, the natural reaction is like, how is that possible? It was supposed to be 6 months, et cetera. And so people start doing the math of the time and it doesn't add up. But I just think he means that, he's going to be on the field. Hopefully he's throwing and he's doing some level of on-field work by training camp.
Right. And I mean, like you said, the hope is that they have clarity at that 12-week mark, which is because all the reports that we've heard from the UCL, kind of this construction, or not the construction, but the repair surgery, is after that 3-week period, you can start ramping up your throwing, of course, until the 6-month period comes. And I mean, Shanahan provided some clarity today. He talked about how week 1 is kind of where they're thinking, week 4 at the latest. But again, it's too uncertain at the moment. But I mean, I wasn't surprised by the way that Lynch said that, but it is true. I mean, Lynch straight up said that he has probably earned the right to be the guy. And I thought that that was certainly interesting, straight up coming in March, right? Without any, they don't even know if he can step on the field week 1 yet. And it came out in March.
I mean, obviously the caveat is if he's healthy, which I think just none of us
Right.
know. Brock probably doesn't know. His doctors probably don't know, right? It's just something that's just going to have to play out over time. And unfortunately, we live in a time where everyone just wants to know and have a resolution right now in March. But unfortunately, just the nature of the situation, the injury, we're not going to hear from Brock and his recovery timeline and when he's going to be ready for another 2 months, 2.5 months. So just got to wait it out and see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. But let's get to the real nugget, right? I mean, earlier today, Kyle Shanahan, he comes out, he has his own press conference. I brought up how he said he envisions Brock Purdy potentially coming back week 1, week 4 at the latest. But the one thing that really caught me was him saying that Trey Lance and Sam Darnold will both earn first team reps this offseason. How'd you feel about that?
Not surprised. And I think, again, this was, something that I felt like caught a lot of people by surprise. But I just think last offseason, when they basically handed Trey Lance the starting job, right? They made sure that Jimmy Garoppolo was on a side field. The only other quarterbacks on the team at that time were Nate Sudfeld. He was a clear backup. And then Brock Purdy, who was the last pick in the draft. So it was clear where the hierarchy was in the quarterback room. And they did that. And I think, you were at training camp a lot, and it was well reported that it was just kind of inconsistent, right? Some days were better than others, some
Yeah.
days weren't as good. And I think they just don't want to put themselves in that situation again, where they're forced into naming Trey Lance a starter. They're forced into saying he's going to be the guy, and then have to backpedal from that if he were to struggle and Sam Darnold were to play better, or Brock Purdy gets healthy, etc. I just think they don't want to put themselves in that situation, because I think last season, if they had just let Jimmy Garoppolo and Trey Lance compete, Jimmy Garoppolo probably outperforms him in camp. Is that safe to say? And probably, earns the starting job come week 1. But they kind of cooked the books to let Lance start, and that makes sense. He was drafted to be the guy. He was drafted at number 3. He would have had a long leash if he was healthy, and who knows how their season would have turned out. And this season, they, the guys on the core bunch is a year older. They're a year more expensive. They're even more all in after signing Javon Hargrave. The NFC is even weaker, in my opinion, than it was last season. So they've got to capitalize on this window, and they can't. I don't think they're in the business of just developing Trey Lance to see what they have. I think they're in the business of winning right now, and they're going to go with who gives them the best opportunity. And ultimately, I think it's going to be some sort of competition. And Trey Lance, in theory, should have the upper hand just because he's been in the system for a couple of years. He's worked with the coaches, knows the skill players. So in theory, he should have the upper hand over Sam Darnold. But I have no problem with them splitting reps. If we all think Trey Lance is truly what he is, he should win this competition. And he should just be the more consistent and better quarterback. But I just think the 49ers are in the business of winning games right now. And I think that's just how they're approaching this.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think I like the way that you phrased it, right? And I want to add one part. I think the word competition freaks out a lot of people, but in reality, competition exists whether it's openly stated or not. When you have a first team guy and a second team guy, regardless of who they are, they're going to be vying for that first team spot. Of course, the talent disparity might not always be as significant in certain aspects, but it's a competition always. And so, to me, I agree. There's no point in handing Trey Lance the job. At this point in his 3rd year, draft capital is irrelevant. He hasn't been able to get on the field due to things outside of his like outside of
Control,
his doing.
right?
And so, yeah, outside of his control. But overall, like you still have to put out who's the best quarterback, understanding
Right,
that the one thing you said, you've got a salary cap. These cap hits continue to increase and increase.
right.
They're only going to increase next year, especially when Javon Hargraves makes $15 million. Everything is coming to an increase because when you do restructures, you push money back. And so you've got guys. Obviously, you made a couple of restructures this offseason with Ward and Warner and things like that. But next year, you also have guys making, I think it's 7 guys making nearly $20 million a year. And
Sounds
so
about right.
you know, it's the cap space. You do have to figure that aspect as well out. And so I think the 49ers know that, and they have to understand you've got to capitalize on this window. Now, I think a lot of people are also kind of looking a little too far into it. Trey Lance right now, Sam Darnold, they should be in a competition. But if you like Trey Lance, if you like Sam Darnold, you shouldn't be like afraid of this competition. If Trey Lance is the guy who people believe he is and who the 49ers believe he is, he's going to beat out a guy who has been a low end starter throughout his career, if a starter at all. And so to me, that's the way I look at it. While I think the best way for Trey Lance to get better is to get more reps, obviously, I don't mind a competition at all. I think he absolutely has to beat Darnold out, but I also think there's significant confidence that he will beat Darnold out. And I think that that was also stated in a way through the contract that Sam Darnold got, where it's a significant amount of incentives, but the base might not be as high as many other quarterbacks on the market.
Absolutely. And I just think any scenario can play out. The scenario where
Right.
Purdy gets healthy quickly and he's back by week 1, he's a full go, and all of a sudden it's his team from, week 1 onwards. There could be the scenario where he doesn't get healthy till midseason, week 4, and Trey Lance runs away with his quarterback competition. He plays the first 4 weeks, he looks really good. They're 3-1, 4-0. At that point, they may not want to switch quarterbacks at that point. They may just ride with the hot hand and Trey Lance, and you never know. This could play out where maybe Trey Lance struggles. Sam Darnold is just more familiar. He's in the best situation he's probably been in his career in this offense. And with this like skill position group, all of a sudden he looks good, and all of a sudden now he's starting. And you never like there's just a ton of different scenarios. And I don't truly think any scenario would really surprise me. And I think the 49ers this offseason compared to last aren't going to force a situation. Last offseason, they forced Trey Lance to get all the first team reps, which makes sense. And then based off of how training camp played out, they probably hedged that bet a little bit by bringing Jimmy Garoppolo back and just giving themselves an insurance policy, a security blanket in the event Lance were to get hurt, in the event, his struggles translated to the regular season. All of a sudden you're losing games, right? You just have an experienced veteran who's been there, won games, to just quickly step in. This year, they obviously don't have the Jimmy Garoppolo insurance plan. So got to go with something else. And I think they felt that Sam Darnold probably is that next best insurance plan. And I think they're just going to let this play out. And so I think they're so hesitant with what they say because they're trying not to offend or, dissuade any of these guys or ruin their values publicly. So they're,
Right.
they're just going to be careful with what they say. And I think everything is just being scrutinized under a microscope. And ultimately, I think the play on the field is going to speak for itself. We're all going to be there. We're all going to pay attention to what happens at training camp and preseason. And I think it'll be evident as this quarterback, quote unquote, competition plays out.
I do want to ask you, though, in reference to this before we move on, because like you said, last year, Trey Lance earned the job. Kyle Shanahan himself today spoke about how they believe they would have gone really far if Lance was the quarterback last year. And I mean, a
Does he
good amount
believe
of
that?
praise towards Trey Lance. That's what I'm about to say. Like a good amount of praise towards Trey Lance. I think he said a lot of different things. He said that. He also said that they brought Sam in because they don't know if they could be certain about Brock and his injury. And so, like a couple of different things that he said, kind of praising Trey Lance. But I do want to ask. He said that it's going to be a competition with first team reps. Both are going to earn first team reps. That is a stark difference from last year, where Trey Lance was the sole first team rep guy, and they eliminated, like you said, any possibility of another person coming in if it wasn't for injury. What changed? What happened? What was the stark difference?
I just think Kyle Shanahan, he's good with his media stuff. He generally tells you what he's thinking, but in some of these instances, you got to follow his actions versus what he's actually saying, right? And like I said, you were there at training camp. If they felt confident with Trey Lance, if they were 100% certain, if they knew he was going to be a surefire thing, if they knew he was the guy as they had thought in March, they would have just they would have cut Jimmy Garoppolo and they would have just rolled with Trey Lance, Brock Purdy, and Nate Sudfeld as their 3 quarterbacks, and they just would have moved on. But, we heard the rumblings. We heard the reports from Mike Silver and Albert Breer and all those guys that all the way back in August, they started talking with Jimmy Garoppolo's representation about potentially coming back and seeing if he's willing to do a restructured deal. And they did a good job of cultivating that relationship. And ultimately he came back and it proved fruitful. Right. I don't think it necessarily played out the way they thought it would with Lance, unfortunately getting hurt. Maybe he improves as the season goes on. Maybe they win a bunch of games, but they had tangible pressure last year to win games. They had an extremely good roster. They were in a weak NFC. They had just come off an NFC title appearance. They knew all that going into the offseason. And by the time training camp and preseason and all those reps were in, I think Kyle Shanahan just got to the point where he's like, I just can't roll with just Trey Lance at this moment, given where our roster is and where our team is and our Super Bowl window and all that type of stuff. And he hedged that bet last year. And I think he's kind of doing the same this year, right? And I think it'd be different if Brock Purdy was healthy because they would just name Brock Purdy the starter and they would just roll with Purdy and Lance. But given the fact that Purdy's unhealthy, they don't know where his injury situation lies. They don't know if he's going to come back or when he's going to come back and how he's going to look when he comes back. You have to have a plan B, and that plan B just happens to be Darnold. I don't know why, what has them believing in Darnold so much, but he's clearly the plan B in case one of the other 2 guys don't work out. So I just think that's what it is. I don't think it's a lack of belief. It's just trying to give yourself another insurance policy and trying to just insulate yourself as much as possible in the event Purdy doesn't come back and Lance just doesn't continue to improve.
Yeah, I think in a way it's hedging your bets on both quarterbacks. It's not an indictment on either one, but you're hedging your bets on both. I know in that contract it says that they expect Darnold to be active for 7 games, kind of somewhat of I think that's the likely to be in part, kind of somewhat an indication that he could be the backup for 7 games, meaning if an injury occurs or if Purdy isn't ready or if some injury occurs, you've got a guy who can at least be active for 7 games in that deal. And so I think that, there are certain things with Sam Darnold that they do like. I think it's also an option for him, kind of a stopgap. You learn under Shanahan the injuries. I question it more for Darnold than I did for the 49ers initially, but obviously with the incentive part aside. But I want to ask you this now, because we've heard about a couple of things with the way that Kyle Shanahan talked today, with the way the 49ers have done business. They also said that all 3 of their quarterbacks, it's like they wouldn't be reluctant to move on in a way. So I do want to ask, do you envision a scenario where the 49ers end up trading Trey Lance this offseason?
Not necessarily. And there's, again, a couple angles to this. First, from a cap standpoint, if they trade him before June 1st, they incur $11 million in dead cap. So, and I think his salary and his cap hit right now is 9.3. So in theory, you'd be paying $1.7 million extra to just get rid of him. And so it'd be effectively like you're buying, a draft pick at $11 million. And then becomes a discussion like, what do you get on the trade market for him? I don't think you're going to get a 1st-round pick. I mean, I don't see it. And that would have to be before the draft. I just really don't see that. So you're basically buying a day 2 pick for $11 million. I don't see that. And I don't know. I don't also think you can do that until Brock Purdy's injury timeline. It makes no sense to punt on Trey Lance when you don't know if Brock Purdy's going to be back, how he's going to look, etc. So that part doesn't make sense to me. And then ultimately, say, you go through the offseason, you go through training camp, you go through preseason, you determine that Sam Darnold is the better player, then at that point, Trey Lance's value is probably in the tank because he just got beat out by, like you called him, a low-end starter. Yeah, a guy who's been on 3 teams in 5 years or 6 years. So now, what are you trading him for? So it's just a complicated scenario. It's weird because a lot of the big J's in the national media don't necessarily mention him. They always talk about Brock Purdy this, or now it's kind of like, hey, maybe Sam Darnold could be the guy, which gives you kind of the idea maybe they're done with him. I just think like I said, you just let this play out and see where it goes. So I just think it's hard to preemptively make a decision in March before you've seen Trey Lance healthy, stepped on, on the field, see what he can do. And you just let the chips fall where they may.
I mean, I agree. I do agree. And I think it's unrealistic in general because, like you said, the value for Trey Lance right now, he hasn't played. The whole point, the whole reason the 49ers are in this situation is because Lance himself hasn't played. So opposing teams don't really know what they have in
Yeah.
Lance, the guy who hasn't really seen any physical reps in a while, because you go back to his college film, he didn't play the COVID year. He had one game that year. Overall, the college film is also pretty limited in terms of the amount of reps. And so I don't know exactly what his trade value would be.
Yeah.
And just because of the uncertainty there, it absolutely doesn't warrant spending more money on top of his $9.8 million cap hit to trade him. I think that's really the deal breaker. Also, the 49ers themselves have said how they like this three quarterback combination.
Right.
And I think last year was, in a way, a wake up call where I believe they're going to now go after three quarterbacks and really roster three quarterbacks on the 53. They did it last year for the first time in a while. And normally teams, like I think about 25 to 30% of the teams, about 8 to 10 teams do it on a regular basis. But the 49ers, I mean, they're a team who has faced a good amount of quarterback injuries. They have to pay Trey Lance anyway. Might as well keep him on the roster, see what he has, understanding that you drafted him with third overall pick and could envision, like, whatever you envisioned of him then. Shanahan said it himself. I mean, they could envision now.
And here's the other thing. The best part about, being able to have a young quarterback is the rookie contract. And so he'd be going into going into year 3. So a team that trades for him, let's play out this hypothetical, has to pick up the 5th-year option by the end of the season. So really you get one season with Lance, and then you got to pick up a 5th-year option or, extend him, after year 4 if you don't pick up the 5th-year option. It gets complicated fast. And so, it just really just limits his market. And so I just think you just play it out with Trey Lance. You keep him clearly a high level guy. The players in the locker room like him. I don't think it's anything like personal, none of that stuff. High level. He helped Brock Purdy last season, down the stretch when he wasn't playing with playbook and breaking down film cut-ups and all that type of stuff. So he's clearly a valuable addition in the quarterback room. So you might as well just maintain that, especially if you're not, saving any money against the cap before June 1st, at least.
I agree. Now, I do want to ask you, we're talking about this situation heading into next year. We've heard it's an uphill battle in a way for Lance. But as of now, do you envision Lance is going to be the day one starter, or are you kind of in the unclear boat at the moment?
Probably in the unclear boat. I don't think it's going to be Brock Purdy. I just don't think he's going to be back. I mean, you just kind of put the surgery timelines together. Realistically, he's probably not going to, be anywhere close to 100% at training camp in the preseason. So he's just missing a lot of live reps. And I think it'd be a big ask to just come in cold and be like, yep, let's throw him out week 1. So, feels like he's not going to be the guy week 1. Kyle Shanahan kind of hinted at like week 4 or 8 months. And so when he says that, he's probably heard it, from a doctor or from, someone close to Brock Purdy. I just don't think he's making those numbers just out of thin air. So given that, it would have to be one of the other guys. And I just, I kind of have no idea. You would think it's Trey Lance, just given, he's probably the more coveted, touted quarterback right now compared to Darnold, just given he's unknown, right? So we just don't know. Whereas Darnold, I think most people just kind of have an opinion of him. So I would lean Lance, experience in the offense, kind of all the things I mentioned, but just kind of unclear. Yeah.
It's tough. I mean, it definitely is understanding the landscape of it. Nobody, this is unprecedented waters in that nobody knows what is going to happen with Brock Purdy. Nope. This is the second time the 49ers have faced it, but I think the third time in NFL in general. And even with Nick Mullins' case, he was there for training camp on day 1, I believe, but really that arm strength only came back a month or a month and a half after that beginning, right into the beginning of the season that year. And so again, so many variables at the moment. I would say Trey Lance right now is the day 1 starter, just because don't think Purdy ends up being healthy. And with that scenario in mind, I want to ask you this because the 49ers haven't done this in the Shanahan era, despite the amount of quarterback controversy that they've had. And that is pulled their starter due to play in the middle of the season, which is why, given the talk, the confidence around Brock Purdy, do you think that that could change this year?
That Kyle Shanahan pulls a quarterback for performance.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, who knows how it plays out with Trey Lance last year, right? Because obviously week 1 in the monsoon, like you can kind of throw that out. Week 2, I mean, it started to come together a little bit, right, in that first quarter. So you just don't know how it plays out. Does he just continue on that trajectory and they, kind of right the ship after week 1 and Kyle Shanahan sticks with him, or would it have gotten ugly and are they 2-4 and Kyle's like, oh my God, we can't do this again 2 years in a row. It's time to move to Jimmy. Like there's a possibility it would have happened last season. And, the injury just caused that situation to never, cause it to happen. So I can see it. I don't think it's going to play out that way this year. I could see a scenario, like I mentioned, where Trey Lance is the week 1 starter. He's playing for a month. He's playing well. They just continue to ride with him. I could see a scenario where it's Trey Lance, but maybe it's up and down, and they just kind of ride it out until Brock Purdy gets healthy, and then Brock Purdy's the guy when he's back. So I could see that. I could see same thing for Sam Darnold. Maybe Sam Darnold's the week 1 starter and he struggles and Brock Purdy comes back. Or maybe he struggles, he gets pulled for Trey Lance. Like I could see all these scenarios. Like we could do this again week 3 and we could be talking about all these scenarios. And if you told me any of these, I would believe you 1,000%.
And I mean, that's the funny part. Talking about the situation at the moment, I'd say this is the first year where I think the 49ers would consider it pretty significantly. I think this is somewhat of an inflection point in the Shanahan Lynch era. Year 7, you've been there three times in the past 4 years. You've made the NFC Championship, that is, and then you've made the Super Bowl as well. But with the window dwindling down, with the emphasis on you need to win with that rookie quarterback in a way, that's the best way to maximize this roster. You've got pretty much this year, maybe next year as well. You've got this 2-year window, and I think they've got to capitalize on it. And so, whoever the best option that is, I understand the value of development and the argument that I provide for the reason why the 49ers go with Trey Lance is that you're not banking on his week one floor. You're not banking on his potential either, but you're banking on that potential translating into the floor by week 18, so that when he's there in the playoffs, you understand that you've got a quarterback who you had the thought process of could take you to the Super Bowl 3 years ago. That's the way that I think the 49ers need to envision this. If they believe that that floor in week 18, based on the progress that Lance shows, not only in the offseason, but also in the early part of the season, should he be the starter, they believe that floor can be strong enough for them to win the Super Bowl in week 18. That's what matters. It can't be up to potential at that point, because obviously potential is for future. You want to know what the floor is, not necessarily week 1, but more so what would it be in week 18.
I agree. And I think this year the pressure is more tangible. I mean, DraftKings set their over under for the win total at like 11.5. I think that's the highest in the NFC. They're the favorite to come out of the NFC. I don't think they were last year, if I remember correctly. And so, the way they're viewing it is we've got this 2-year window. I just think given the cap hits, the age of some of their core guys, Trent Williams, Eric Armstead, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, I think they've got like a 2-year window to capitalize and win the whole thing. And I think there's tangible pressure on them to start hot. I mean, the last 2 years, the deal. They started 3-5 and 3-4, and now you're climbing uphill. And last season, they almost got to the 1 seed. A couple years ago, obviously they went the wild card route, but I think there's tangible pressure to like start the season well and put yourself in a position to get home field advantage in that bye. And now that there's only 1 bye, that I think that bye means a lot. I mean, allows your guys to get healthy, gives you home field advantage, and the difference in the NFC title game could just, outside of the injury, obviously, is simply just the fact that they had to travel to Philadelphia, hostile environment on the road. Like you'd much rather have that be at Levi's this season. So I get what you mean about, you want to make sure you're ready come week 18 in the playoffs, but I think they have tangible pressure to like start hot and, don't fall behind the 8 ball and put yourself in a position to win the NFC West and be the 1 seed come playoff time.
Absolutely. I mean, after the last few years, you talk about what's been the issue the last few years. They've traveled a lot. I mean, on the road this past year, obviously they had a home game. They had 2 home games, and then they traveled to Philly. They haven't like apart from 2019, I believe, when they were there,
They were the
they've
1 seed.
traveled a good amount. Yeah, and so they were there throughout. What do you call it? Throughout, and they made the Super Bowl. But in 2021, they were on the road the entire time. They 2022, they were on the road in the most important game. So they've definitely had to, they've experienced that. And like you've said, they're somewhat of a second half team. They've had really strong second halves. 2019 was the anomaly where they were 8-1 to start the year, but the last 2 years, I mean, not the best start. Second half team, they ended up getting it done. But you're right. I think that it is important to kind of jump off strong, and I think that it will influence what they end up doing this offseason.
Agreed, and that's why I think there's tangible pressure on whoever the quarterback is come out the gates, whether that's Trey Lance, whether that's Sam Darnold, whether that's Brock Purdy. The expectations are going to be sky freaking high come week 1 with this team, with this roster. I know they have a first place schedule, but week NFC, I mean, I think most fans are going to be looking for them to just start hot and stay hot. So, yeah.
Right. I want to ask you this question from the chat before we move on. Is it just me, Patobo Hammer says, or did Shanahan show more faith in Trey than we all thought he had? Did you take that away from today's presser?
Not really. I think he's consistently said the same things, which is, they believe in Trey as a person. They believe in his work ethic. They believe in his football IQ. They believe in his character as a locker room leader, all that type of stuff. And they also believe if he had the opportunity to play, that, eventually he would get better. And unfortunately, because of injuries, it just hasn't played itself out. So I think they've consistently said the same thing. And maybe Shanahan just said it slightly differently today, which is why people are maybe thinking there's more faith. And so ultimately I firm believer that the actions that you take on the field show me more about what you really think than what you tell me in a press conference in March. So we saw last year, right? They hedged their bet last year with the Jimmy Garoppolo insurance policy. And it kind of feels like they've hedged both sides, both Brock Purdy being healthy and Trey Lance, improving with Sam Darnold this year. So we'll see how it plays out. We'll see if Kyle Shanahan has full faith in Trey Lance, he'll be the starter come week 1 if Brock Purdy isn't healthy. So we'll see how it plays itself out. And at that point, I think we'll know how Kyle truly feels about Lance.
Yeah, definitely. Moving forward, though, to the other part of the discussion, Lynch spoke a little bit about right tackle. 49ers, that's been one of the positions that they've not necessarily come away with a prime solution, but they have a guy who they believe in Colton McKivitz. Lynch talked about McKivitz and the position itself, saying that McKivitz is the guy at the moment, but he did indicate that there will be a competition, despite the 49ers feeling pretty strong about their guy in McKivitz. What do you think about the position after the 49ers signed Matt Pryor, who seems like he could be the swing tackle? Is there more to be done here? Do you think that this is a short-term option? What do you believe at right tackle?
They've got a couple options, right? They've got the young guy in Colton McKivitz, who they just extended. He's been a spot starter at left tackle for Trent Williams. We remember the Week 18 game in LA a couple seasons ago. He filled in for him this past season. Better pass blocker, I think, than run blocker, at least compared to Mike McGlinchey. I feel like they're kind of the opposite in terms of what they bring to the table. And then obviously they got a couple of veteran guys. Matt Pryor, who's with the Colts, I think. John Feliciano, I know he plays inside mostly, but I think he does have experience at playing tackle, if I remember correctly, previously in his career. So they'll have some competition. I imagine they'll add a young guy or two through the draft, undrafted free agent, etc. That'll just compete, and we'll see, right? Last year, coming in at this point last year, we all just assumed that right guard was going to be Dan Barnskill, but they added a rookie in Spencer Burford. He balled out in camp. He eventually took on that role, and looks like he's just going to be the starter moving forward. So once again, it's kind of a cop-out answer, but we'll just kind of let itself play out. And I think they're just trying to get as many bodies at that spot to compete, just because you have a stalwart left tackle in Trent Williams, who costs a lot of money against the cap, and so along the offensive line and just in roster construction, you're going to have to, go the discount route somewhere. And I think they've chosen to do that at a right tackle because they feel confident with the other 4 positions and the 4 guys that they have.
Yeah, definitely. And right tackle, I think, is an interesting one because the 49ers didn't spend, obviously, at the position. A couple of positions where the last 2 off seasons, you look at where the 49ers felt they had holes, they went after the position. Lynch talked about D tackle. Obviously, the play wasn't necessarily as high. Armstead wasn't he wasn't there for the entire year. Kinlaw, up and down year, again facing the injuries. Some weaknesses were exploited in certain games down the stretch as well. So you go ahead and you insulate that position. The year before was Charvarius Ward at cornerback. And so right tackle right now, seems like the 49ers, they have an idea of what they want to do, but there's still work to be done because San Francisco, based on McKivitz's contract, doesn't seem like he's going to be the long-term option. It's a 2-year deal worth $5.8 million, but the first year, it's really, when you look at it, they can get out of it after 1 year if they want. Regardless, it's not too expensive to where he can also be the swing tackle as he's been the last few years. But they did sign Matt Pryor as well, adding depth because they didn't really have much tackle depth behind McKivitz and Trent Williams. If you want to consider Jalen Moore a tackle as he's played, then you can. But I think that he's on the roster bubble at the moment after some uninspiring off seasons at tackles so far. I think the 49ers have to go out in a way, draft a guy, which might mean trading up, but also might mean staying where they are and looking for a developmental guy.
Absolutely. And it's a difficult position. I mean, the deal. There's just less offensive linemen that come out every year. And it's way harder to find tackles than it is defensive linemen. And so when everyone is complaining that, why can't they just get both these tackle spots right? It is so difficult to find 2 guys, especially when you haven't had your first round pick in 3 years. Right. Yeah. You spent all of it for Trey Lance and then you haven't had first round picks. It's like those guys typically don't drop in this draft, especially the really athletic, really skilled, really talented ones. So yeah, they've had to go kind of the bargain route to replace it. So we'll see what they end up doing. But I just think they feel confident in their skill group. They feel confident in the rest of the offensive line, their play caller, their quarterback, that, ultimately if it was McKivitz, that they could work around him. Because, 2 years ago, McGlinchey missed the majority of the season. It was Tom Compton at right tackle. They were in the NFC title game. So I think they feel that McKivitz is probably a step up from that, and they can win games with him.
I mean, I hope so. We'll see. Offseason will be the first look really at him as the starter. He's moved around. He's been their swing guy, and he's played guard as well. So definitely will be interesting to take a look at him. But to wrap today's show up, Akash, I do want to ask you, going back to the execs, but not really a team-based thing, more so on the futures of John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan. Like I said earlier in the show, it's year 7. They've gotten good results, but they haven't been able to get the one thing they want, a Super Bowl. Do you think that this year do you think that the 49ers could move on if they don't get the results they had this year, knowing that the 49ers missed on Trey Lance, which would likely be the case if they don't reach their goal?
Right. So I think there's a couple ways to look at this. One, I don't think Jed York wants to go through a coaching and GM search. I think that's probably the last thing he wants to do. So I think he generally likes Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch. I think he wants to stick with this regime. And guess what? They've won a lot of freaking games over the last 4 seasons. Since 2019, I think they've got they're top 3 in regular season wins among all teams, top 3 or top 5. And obviously they've got 6 playoff wins and a couple NFC championship appearances and home playoff games. I mean, Jed York is just absolutely raking it in. And of course they haven't won the Super Bowl, but I think most franchises would sell their soul to have the type of success that the 49ers have had over the last 4 years. So I don't think it's a make or break year. I did think when they drafted Trey Lance that Kyle Shanahan's long-term future probably depended on it. But guess what? They've built such a good roster. He's such a good coach that they've been able to win with a rotating door at quarterback. And ultimately, they may have found something in Brock Purdy, or maybe Trey Lance develops into that guy, or maybe Sam Darnold is good enough to be kind of your fill-in starter, or whatever the case is. But I don't think it's quite make or break. I do think this core group of players probably has a couple years together, and then we'll kind of see how it plays out. Ultimately, if you hit on a franchise quarterback, then you can replace the talent around him, right? Because it's a head coach and quarterback league. They would have that guy, and then they would have a high floor at that point, and it would be hard to let go of either Lynch or Shanahan. I just think if they whiff on the quarterback and then it gets a little dicey when this roster isn't as good in a couple of years, that's when, maybe we would be talking about Shanahan in the hot seat, but absolutely not. I feel like a third of the NFL would fire their coach if Kyle Shanahan was available to go hire him right now. So I promise you, Jed York isn't thinking about letting him go.
I think it's too early. I've definitely had the talk about Kyle Shanahan before, and I'm a guy who has supported Kyle Shanahan through a lot. I think that he does get over criticized by a good portion of the fan base who doesn't understand necessarily how integral he's been and really how hard it is to sustain success in the NFL. And so he's done a fantastic job, him and John Lynch, kind of building this team, but also sustaining that success year in and year out, despite the ongoing salary cap and things like that. To me, though, I think when you look at it, the earliest you can really discuss this is when his contract's up. I think that that's the earliest, which is, I believe, in 3 years, because that would give you the 2 remaining years on both rookie contracts for his quarterbacks, and then a year after in a way to figure it out if he misses really on both of these quarterbacks. Is it likely that he misses on both of his top quarterbacks? Doesn't seem that way, and also doesn't seem like he won't be able to get success without them. But
I mean,
if
they could
anything were
just
to
they
go
could
for
just
it.
pivot, right? Like say Brock Purdy doesn't end up being the same guy. Trey Lance isn't it. All of a sudden, Kirk Cousins is a free agent next year. Like you just never know, right?
Exactly.
There's so many different variables to play itself out. And again, Shanahan's just proven himself to be such a good coach. You get, middling quarterback play. They're winning 9-10 games with a competent roster. And I just think the 49ers scouting department is excellent. I mean, they continue to
Mhm.
find guys, and he's good at hiring and developing coaches. So their roster churn kind of in that middle to bottom part of the roster just continues to be really good. I mean, they've replaced, obviously Dre Greenlaw taking spots. I mean, guys like Diamador Lenore, Talanoa Funga. We'll see if Drake Jackson can be that guy, but Aaron Banks, Spencer Burford. I mean, they just continue to find starters in the draft. And as long as you continue to do that, and I think they can, I think they'll just be around for a while.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think so as well. And if anything were to happen, I would presume that it would be a general manager move rather than a head coach move. Um, Lynch has also hinted that he doesn't want to necessarily stick in this job for a long, long time. So wouldn't be surprised if he moves back to a television role like he was rumored in last offseason, or a different role, especially should the 49ers win a Super Bowl. But if not, maybe in the next few years. Obviously, the 49ers have a guy in Adam Peters, assistant general manager, who's been with the organization as well and elected to stay over some other opportunities. So I think that they have a good structure, even if Lynch does depart. But regardless, it's important to note the job certainly that those two have done during their tenures here.
No, 100%. I think, ultimately, yeah, at the end of the day, you're looking to win a Super Bowl, but I mean, the success they have had over the last 4 years, I feel like only the Chiefs could probably say they've had a better run. I mean, the Niners have been just kind of right there, and they've maintained a consistent high level of play despite different quarterbacks and different rosters. So I just think it speaks to what those two guys have built, and I just think they're respected league wide. And so we'll see in a couple of years, but I think for right now, it's just a fun discussion point on Twitter, but nothing else.
Right, exactly. Last topic for today, want to bring up Brandon Ayuk because the 49ers, they said earlier this week, John Lynch said they're going to pick up his fifth-year option, as expected. But the real discourse when it comes to the future talk, it comes next year when Ayuk is expected to have an extension, obviously next season. But Deebo Samuel also makes $28 million a year. Do you think the 49ers can, or not necessarily can, but do you think they would have both of those receivers under contract with big extensions?
Yes and no. So from an offensive skill standpoint, right? I think next season or in 2024, you're gonna have Deebo Samuel at a cap hit of around $28.5 million. You're gonna
Right.
have Brandon Ayuk presumably on the fifth year option. I think it's at like $14 million. So between the two of them, they're going to make $42 million. You're going to have Christian McCaffrey. I think currently his cap hit schedule will be about $12 million. We'll see. It's all non-guaranteed salary. So between those three guys, they're in the books for $54 million. George Kittle's cap hit's high. I mean, eventually you're just going to hit a point where you're going to have to move on from one of those guys. And I think this is probably the last season that those four are probably together. If I had to guess in 2024, one of those guys or two of those guys probably aren't there. And me personally, it's hard. This way, in the biggest moments, he put the offense on his back in 2021 and basically carried him to an NFC title game. But he also plays a brand of football that isn't sustainable, I think, right? Just long-term injuries, kind of the home run plays he hits, the way he plays both as a running back and a receiver. Just don't know if it's sustainable. And then you look at Brandon Ayuk as an ascending player, route runner, someone who you could see playing a long time, is just more malleable in different offenses, is more traditional wide receiver, so can fit the skill set of different quarterbacks. And then you got Christian McCaffrey, who, again, similar skill set to Debo, a little bit more consistent, I'd say, but maybe doesn't have the high end that Debo did in 2021. So I just think you got to make some choices there. And, in a perfect world, maybe you trade the guy with the highest cap hit because you get the most, money back, but it becomes complicated. So every time the 49ers have had two expensive guys at the same position or similar positions, they've had to choose, right? Buckner,
Right.
Armstead. They chose Armstead because they got the first round pick for Buckner. Obviously, this past offseason, McGlinchey, Williams, they played tackle, obviously different tackle positions, but they decided to obviously keep Trent Williams and let Mike McGlinchey walk. Next offseason is going to be Ayuk and Debo. I just think one of those guys, or I should say one of McCaffrey, Debo, Ayuk, probably not going to be on the team after this season. So we'll see who that ends up being. It'll probably depend on draft compensation, what they can get back, what kind of cap space they can save, and what they end up doing with Brandon Ayuk's deal. And I presume they tried to get Brandon Ayuk for an extension this offseason, which is probably why you saw him respond. They probably tried to get him for one of those cheap,
Right.
under market deals because his stats don't necessarily match what he brings to the table just because he's the fourth option on this team, on a team that likes to run the ball first. So he probably felt slighted and he's like, nah, we'll play it out, type thing that probably doesn't help the 49ers because he's probably only going to get better and wide receiver contracts continue to get more expensive. So we'll see how that plays out, but that's just my prediction.
I think that's a very fair prediction. I'm going to agree with you here because when you talk about the way that the 49ers operate, I mean, in general, it's going to be tough to figure out how they go about next offseason with keeping their entire roster intact. Right now, they have about 19 million in cap, and remember, you've got to sign a draft class. But also, Nick Bosa is going to get an extension. Ayuk should get an extension. There are a couple of other factors on top
Aaron
of.
Banks.
I mean, Aaron Banks might get an extension, and you'll have free agency plans as well with other players to re-sign. And so I think that
Hufunga.
you can name after name. I mean, there are a couple of players on this team that the 49ers will want to bring back as well, be it via extension or just to re-sign. And so you've got to create cap space in some way or another. We'll see how the 49ers do it because Debo Samuel's contract does make it a little tougher to move on from him. I think you save about $8 million, but you incur a pretty strong dead cap hit, but he seems like the likeliest to be moved within the next offseason or two. And so next offseason, I think is going to be some murky waters where the 49ers are going to have to navigate, understanding that they're going to finally have to break the core up. They've talked a lot about culture and how they've tried to instill the right culture, and really they have a good pedigree for bringing their guys back. But I think that some tough decisions will have to be made to one of the core players of their team next year. Samuel might be a guy. You might even see George Kittle be a guy if they don't restructure him this offseason. So I think
Yeah,
I
I would
agree
agree
with you
there.
in that one of those four. Yeah, one of those four, if not more.
Yeah, I brought up Banks and Hufunga because those guys at 2021 draft class, they weren't first round picks, so they're on a
Yeah,
4-year contract, meaning you can extend after 3, which is at the end of this season. And if Banks is on his trajectory, guards make a lot of money these days. And
right.
Hufunga, safety, he's been an All Pro already, so he's gonna have some escalators in his rookie contract. He's gonna look to want an extension. So, I mean, there's gonna be some decisions to be made, and I just think it's going to come at the expense of one of those skill guys, which puts even more pressure on this season and needing to deliver because the team's potentially going to look a little different in the next few years.
Definitely, definitely. And like you said, it reverts back to what we were originally talking about, the whole quarterback situation, the amount of pressure. We talked about how there's tangible pressure not only on the coaching staff, not only on the team, but more so on the quarterbacks who now have to deliver despite several factors going against their way. Purdy and his health, Lance and his inexperience, Darnold and his previous experience. So a lot of moving parts here.
They're a content machine, though. So,
I mean, that's all we want, right? That's all we want. But Akash, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your insight here with the quarterback situation. Any last words before we head on out of here?
Nothing much, man. I appreciate you having me. Appreciate the work you've been doing. It's been awesome to see over the last year or two. So, yeah, man, keep up the good stuff.
Appreciate you. Guys in the chat, as always, thank you guys, as well as the listeners tuning in with the audio section. We'll be back with some more content tomorrow. 49ers always providing something or another for us to talk about. So appreciate the franchise there. But overall, Akash, you were great today. Thank you so much. And we'll see you guys soon.